For over 50 years, she sat at the same dinner table as the rest of them. She passed the same bread basket.
Bless this food with the same words.
She slept under the same roof.
And every single day of her life she felt it. That quiet, invisible wall between her and the rest of her family. Nobody ever said it out loud. Nobody ever had to. It was in the way her father's eyes moved past her at Christmas. In the way her siblings shared jokes she was never quite part of. In the way her mother, the one person who should have protected her, sometimes looked at her with something that wasn't quite love. Something closer to guilt. For 58 years, Margaret told herself she was imagining it. That families are complicated, that she was being too sensitive, that she needed to just let it go, pause, and then her mother died. And 3 weeks later, a small white envelope arrived in her mailbox. Inside that envelope was a DNA test she had ordered on a sleepless night, half expecting to feel foolish when the results came back normal. They did not come back normal. What Margaret read in that envelope, in her kitchen, alone, at 11 o'clock at night, confirmed something she had spent nearly 6 decades trying to convince herself wasn't true. And it didn't just answer her questions, it blew her family apart. Stay with me, because this story goes deeper than a DNA test. It goes deeper than one secret, or one lie, or one family's shame. This is a story about what silence does to people over time. And the moment, 58 years in the making, when the truth finally refused to stay buried. Before we go any further, I want you to hold 3 questions in your mind, because everything we're about to walk through, every piece of this story, is building toward answering them. Question 1. Why did Margaret's own family treat her like she didn't belong for her entire life? Was it something she did? Something she said? Or was it something none of them were willing to admit, even to themselves? Question 2. What exactly was the secret her family was keeping? Who knew it first? And how far back does it go? And question 3, and this is the one that still keeps me up at night. When the DNA results came back, and the truth was finally sitting there on the table in black and white, who was the one person in that family most destroyed by it? Because here's what I'll tell you right now. It wasn't who you'd expect. The answers to those 3 questions are going to take us through decades of silence. Through a small Ohio town where everyone knew everyone, and no one said anything real. Through a deathbed secret. Through a phone call between 2 strangers who shared the same blood and had never once spoken, and through a revelation so precise, so quietly devastating that it reframed every single memory Margaret had ever held on to. So let's go back, all the way back, to where this story really begins. Margaret grew up in a small town in rural Ohio, the kind of place where the gas station doubled as a general store, where the high school football team was the center of the universe every Friday night, where people went to the same church their grandparents had gone to, sat in the same pews, and kept their business to themselves. She was born in 1961, the third of 5 children, and from her very first memories, she felt like the odd one out. Now, I want to be careful here, because what Margaret experienced wasn't dramatic, it wasn't abuse, it wasn't cruelty. It was something far more insidious than that. It was 1,000 small moments spread across a lifetime, the kind of moments that are easy to dismiss one at a time, but impossible to ignore. You lay them all out together. Her older brother got a car for his 16th birthday. Margaret got a handshake and a card. Her younger sister's bedroom was repainted twice. Margaret's had the same peeling wallpaper from the day they moved in. At Easter, the other kids wore new outfits. Margaret wore what fit. When relatives came to visit and gathered around the living room, someone was always just slightly in the way, always slightly in the background, always one step outside the circle. That someone was always Margaret. Her father, Robert, was a hard man in the way that a lot of men from that generation were hard. He didn't raise his voice much, didn't say a great deal, communicated through what he chose to do, and what he chose not to do. And what he chose almost consistently was to not quite look at Margaret the way he looked at the others. She told me, and I want you to really hear this, she said. Other kids, when their dad walked in the room, they'd light up. And he'd look at them like they were the best thing he'd ever made. He never looked at me like that. Not once. Not in 58 years. Her mother, Carol, was different, warmer. The kind of woman who baked on Sundays and remembered everyone's birthday and kept the house running like a quiet machine. and she was kinder to Margaret than Robert ever was. But even Carol, even her own mother, had moments that Margaret couldn't explain. A pause that went on a second too long. A look across the room that Margaret caught, just barely before Carol turned away. An apology in her eyes that never became words. Margaret always told herself she was reading too much into it. She told herself that for 58 years. As she got older, the gaps became harder to paper over. When her siblings started their adult lives, Robert helped them. He co-signed loans. He made phone calls. He showed up. When Margaret needed help, when she was 23 and trying to get on her feet after a difficult first marriage, her father sat across from her at the kitchen table, looked somewhere just past her shoulder, and said, "You'll figure it out," and that was it. When Robert died in 2007, he left behind a modest estate, a house, some savings, a few pieces of land that had been in the family for decades. His will divided everything among his children. Margaret's name was not in it, not a footnote, not an explanation, just absent. The family attorney told her it was probably an oversight. Her siblings said the same thing. They offered her a small amount from their shares, the way you offer someone a tip. She declined, and she never brought it up again, but she never forgot it either. For years, Margaret carried this weight in silence. She moved away, built a life, had children of her own, tried with everything she had to give them the warmth she never quite received. But the question never left her. Why? Why did she always feel like a guest in her own family? Why did her own father look through her like she was made of glass? What did they know that she didn't? And then, in the spring of 2019, at her mother's funeral, her aunt leaned in close. Carol's sister, a woman Margaret had known her entire life, and she whispered 5 words. 5 words that Margaret had been waiting, without knowing it, to hear for 58 years. "You know you were different, don't you?" Margaret didn't respond. She just stood there at the graveside in the pale Ohio spring and felt the ground shift under her feet. Not because the words were a shock, but because they weren't. That night, Margaret went home. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time, staring at nothing, turning her aunt's words over and over in her mind like a stone she couldn't put down. "You know you were different, don't you?" "Different how?" She opened her laptop. She didn't entirely know what she was looking for. She just started typing. And somewhere around midnight, she found herself on the website for one of those consumer DNA testing kits. The kind you see advertised on television. The kind that tells you your ethnic heritage and matches you with distant relatives. She ordered one. $23, free shipping. And then she closed her laptop, went to bed, and told herself she was being ridiculous. The kit arrived 8 days later. She almost didn't open the package. She left it on the kitchen counter for 2 days, walked past it, made coffee past it, came home from work and glanced at it and kept moving. On the 3rd day, she opened it, completed the test, and mailed it back, and then she waited. She told me those 3 weeks were unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Not quite dread, not quite hope, something in between, something that sits in your chest and doesn't let you take a full breath. She checked her email every morning before she got out of bed. She refreshed the testing company's website more times than she could count. She didn't tell anyone she had ordered it. Not her children, not her closest friend, nobody. This was between her and whatever the truth turned out to be. On a Tuesday night in October of 2019 at 11:14 p.m., she got the email. Her results were ready. She sat down at her kitchen table. She clicked the link. She read the first line of the results. Long pause, and then she slid off her chair and sat down on the kitchen floor. And she didn't get up for an hour. She didn't cry right away. She told me that. She said the first thing she felt wasn't sadness. It wasn't even shock. It was recognition, like some part of her, some quiet, stubborn, knowing part of her that had been whispering for 58 years, finally exhaled. Because the results were unambiguous. Margaret shared no DNA with her father. Not a fraction. Not an error margin, nothing. Robert, the man who had barely looked at her whole life, was not her biological father. She sat on that kitchen floor, in the quiet of a Tuesday night, and she thought about every Christmas. Every birthday he'd looked past her. Every time he'd said nothing when he should have said something. Every time she'd told herself she was imagining it. She hadn't been imagining anything. He had known, all of them, she was almost certain, had known. and not one of them had ever said a word. The next morning, Margaret called her aunt, the same aunt who had leaned in at the funeral, the same woman who had whispered those 5 words and then said nothing else. The aunt picked up on the third ring. Margaret told her what she had found, calmly, precisely, like she was reading from a document. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then the aunt said, "I was wondering when you'd figure it out." She didn't apologize. She didn't seem surprised. She just sounded tired, like someone who had been waiting decades to put a heavy bag down. Margaret asked the only question that mattered. "Who is my father?" The aunt hesitated, said she wasn't sure it was her place to say, said Carol had made her promise, said some things were better left alone. Margaret told her that she was 58 years old, that her mother was dead, that her father was dead, that she had spent her entire life on the outside of a secret she hadn't consented to, and that she was owed an answer. Another silence. And then the aunt spoke. She told Margaret it had been a man from the church, a family friend. Someone Carol had known before Robert, someone who was, as far as the aunt knew, still living in the area. She gave Margaret a name. Margaret wrote it down. And for the next 3 months, she chased it. She reached out to the man's family through the DNA testing platform. She searched public records. She drove past his old house. She found mutual acquaintances. She left careful, measured messages. Nothing matched, no DNA connection, no one who recognized the story. The name her aunt had given her was wrong. Whether her aunt had made an honest mistake, or whether she had deliberately sent Margaret in the wrong direction to protect someone, Margaret still doesn't know for certain. But she has her suspicions. She went back to the DNA platform, frustrated, exhausted, and starting to wonder if the full truth was simply out of reach. And that's when the notification appeared. A new DNA match. Added to her profile in the last 48 hours. The platform classified it as a close family match, not a distant cousin, not a third-generation relative, a half-sibling. His name was Daniel. He was 61 years old. He lived 40 minutes away from the town where Margaret had grown up, and when she sent him a message through the platform, tentative, careful, not wanting to upend a stranger's life, he responded within the hour. He already knew who she was. He had been waiting for this message for years. Daniel called her that same evening. Margaret told me she almost didn't pick up. She sat there, watching her phone ring, feeling like she was standing at the edge of something she couldn't come back from once she crossed it. She picked up. Daniel's voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this conversation many times, across many years, and still wasn't entirely sure how to have it. He told her that his father, his biological father, had told him something when Daniel was in his 30s, had sat him down one night and confessed that he believed he had a daughter somewhere. A daughter he had never met. A daughter born to a woman named Carol in the early 1960s in a small town in Ohio. A daughter named Margaret. His father's name was a man I'll call Thomas. Thomas had been Carol's first love, the man she had been with before Robert, the man she had, by every account, loved deeply, and been forced to give up. Not because she wanted to, but because her family had arranged her future already. Robert came from a better family. Robert had land and prospects and the approval of Carol's parents. And Thomas had nothing but Carol's heart, which in that world at that time was not enough. Carol married Robert. Thomas eventually married someone else. And life moved on the way life does when people make choices they don't fully choose. Except, not quite. Sometime in the early months of 1961, before the distance between Carol and Thomas became permanent, Margaret was conceived. Robert knew. He knew from the beginning. Carol had told him the truth before the wedding. She had to. The timing left no other explanation. And Robert, this proud, quiet, hard man from a small Ohio town, had made a decision. He would raise the child. He would keep the secret. He would never speak of it. And he would spend the next 58 years, unable to look at his wife's daughter by another man, and unable to say, why. Margaret sat in silence on that phone call for a very long time, and then she said to Daniel quietly, "So he didn't hate me," and Daniel said, "No. He just couldn't forgive himself for staying." The woman who had spent 58 years feeling unwanted had been wanted, by a man who never got to know her, and tolerated, painfully, imperfectly, silently, by a man who couldn't reconcile what he'd agreed to carry. And her mother, the woman who had held this secret like a stone inside her chest for nearly 6 decades, had died 3 weeks before the truth could reach her daughter. 3 weeks. Some stories don't give you the ending you needed. This is one of them. Margaret and Daniel met in person 3 months after that phone call. A diner, a Tuesday afternoon, 2 cups of coffee on a laminate table. 2 strangers with the same blood, trying to figure out what you do with a lifetime's worth of information you never asked for. She told me they talked for 4 hours. About their childhoods, about their parents, about the strange mathematics of a secret that shaped 2 separate lives without either of them knowing it. She said it didn't feel like meeting a brother, not exactly. It felt, she told me, like meeting someone who understood a language no one else in her life had ever spoken. I asked her, toward the end of our conversations, whether she was angry. She thought about it for a long moment, and she said, "I was. For a while, I was furious at my mother, at Robert, at the aunt who sent me down the wrong road, at all of them for making me spend my whole life wondering what was wrong with me." She paused. "But mostly now I just feel sad. Sad for my mother who spent 60 years carrying something that heavy. Sad for Robert, who chose to stay and then couldn't find a way to be kind. Sad for Thomas, who never got to know he had a daughter. And sad for the version of me that spent 58 years thinking the problem was her. I've thought about Margaret's story a great deal since she told it to me, and I keep coming back to one thing. The DNA test didn't break her family. The silence did. The silence had been breaking them for 58 years, slowly, invisibly, in the space between what was true and what was said. In the gap between a man who couldn't look at a little girl and a little girl who couldn't understand why. Silence isn't neutral. It isn't safe. It doesn't protect people the way we tell ourselves it does. It just passes the wound forward to the one person least equipped to understand it. How many families are sitting with something like this right now? How many people, tonight, at some dinner table, in some house that looks fine from the outside, feel exactly what Margaret felt her whole life? That quiet, persistent sense of being just slightly outside the circle, never knowing why, never being told, just carrying it. The DNA test gave Margaret an answer, but what she really needed, what she had always needed, was for someone to simply tell her the truth. She deserved that. She deserved it 58 years ago. So I want to ask you something before you go. And I genuinely want to know what you think. If you were Margaret, if that white envelope was sitting on your kitchen table right now, would you open it or would you leave it sealed? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and this is exactly the kind of question I want to hear your take on. If this story hit you the way I think it did, hit subscribe. Every week, we go this deep. Every week, there's another story that most people will never hear, but everyone needs to. And next week, we're covering a man who lived an entirely double life for 30 years. Different name, different family, different city, same face. And the one small, ordinary mistake that unraveled all of it. You don't want to miss that one. I'll see you there.